Hello and welcome back to the final episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast for 2025. I'm Daniel Watkins, and on today's episode we're joined by another of our favourite recurring guests, the Company of Artisans. In the past, you may have heard them speak to us about aspects of medieval life, from tile making to the scriptorium, but on this episode we'll be hearing about an everyday material that was central to the economy of medieval England and still keeps us warm at this time of year today. We'll be talking about wool. You'll hear about the laborious process needed to create medieval textiles, how it was important to everybody from the working classes to King Edward III, and some of the connections wool and sheep farming have with the history of Alnwick Castle. It's a fascinating look into British history, and we hope you enjoy it. We are very happy to be joined on the Alnwick Castle podcast for what has become almost an annual tradition, where we are here with Company of Artisans, Karen and Charlie. How are you both today?
Very well, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Daniel. Lovely to hear from you. Thank you.
You've been on the podcast before talking about medieval tiles. Mm-hmm. We've talked about alchemy a little bit. We've talked about the scriptorium. But today we're talking about wool. But why are we talking about wool?
Well,
specific to us, it's because Charlie and Jack, the alchemist, this summer built a replica medieval weaving loom. And Charlie has been teaching himself to weave for the past 2 years.
Yeah.
So this last 2 years has been a really deep dive into everything medieval textile and creating a presentation and a demonstration that Charlie brought up to Alnwick this summer in August.
Yeah, it's a way of being able to introduce an industry that was so important to medieval England and Europe, but it's very difficult to interpret and discuss with the general public.
And this was something that was really important in medieval England.
Yes, absolutely, because everybody wore it. It was the main source of clothing, and everybody in society wore it, from the very rich and the elite all the way down to the very poor, both young and old, all wore wool.
Wool was really important, is really important as a fibre, because it keeps you warm and dry even when it's wet. So unlike modern fibres, modern clothing made out of sort of plastic-based material, like sort of fleeces and things like that, we call them fleeces, but they're not really fleece. Fleece is woolen fleece. But wool is unique in that it will trap your body heat. Even when it's soaking wet, it will still keep you warm. It's why the Arctic explorers and people who climbed Everest in the 1950s, they all wore woolen tweed when they were climbing, because it was the best thing to keep them warm. Whereas other fibres like sort of linens and hemp, which were in use as well, they were worn next to the body, but wool was the main outer garment. So all the dresses, all the trousers, all the tops, all the jackets, everything, hats, everything was made of wool. So it's a sustainable fibre, and yeah, it was universal, and the quality of wool in England in particular outstripped all the quality of the wool in Europe. So, and it's to do with our climate and our grass quality, and the fact that we're in Northern Europe and we get rain. Particularly people talk about Wales and Welsh wool. The level of rain and the quality of grass that we have in this country meant that the sheep that were grazing on the grass, their wool that they grew was a much better quality wool than the wool in France and Germany and the Netherlands. So that was why we were known as the main producer of wool in medieval Europe.
And it was our biggest export from this country. It was the biggest money earner for the crown through the whole of the medieval period.
And that compares with all the other industries. So sort of compared with sort of metal and coal and wood, anything else that we had as an export, or grain, any of those, right up until it was the textile industry was the main income generator in this country right up until after the Second World War.
Yeah, 1947.
our taxes, taxes that are raised from the textile industry were the biggest revenue producer right up until current era.
And because of the demand for wool abroad, it was a way for certainly Edward III to have a really big influence on European politics by controlling the supply of wool to the Netherlands. He was able to win or lose allies in his wars to France, and the wool trade actually paid for the continued control of Calais, which was a vitally strategic important port on the French coast.
So we're talking about a material it's not just good for people on a day-to-day basis wearing it, but it affects the country as a whole. It's
absolutely
quite central to all aspects of life in a way.
Yeah, it was. And the growth of the wool industry went hand in hand with the rise of and the expansion of sort of medieval monasteries, because when they built the medieval monasteries, they weren't just sort of a little building in the middle of nowhere. They were also supporting farmland. And so rather like Alnwick with its, you've got the castle and then you've got all the land surrounding the castle and the farmers, the tenant farmers who are farming that land, the medieval monasteries were doing the same thing. So if you had a central monastery in a landscape like Byland or Revo in North Yorkshire, they as a business really managed the wool that was produced, the fleece that was produced from thousands and thousands of sheep. So they were like a central sort of hub that gathered all of that crop each year. So each year that the sheep were shorn, that wool, that fleece was all gathered by the monasteries into central, what we call wool sacks, and then they were exported from that central place across into Europe. And then in the early medieval period, that wool was then woven and spun and woven in Europe, and then that cloth was imported back into Britain. So that then also generated tax. So you've got income being generated for the crown, both with the fleece, the raw fleece, the fresh wool clip leaving the country, but also the beautiful fine woolens being imported into it. So they get two bites of the cherry. They get money both ways. So the crown was very happy that the wool, was generating so much money.
It's not the kind of image that you imagine for a medieval king thinking about these things, but it sounds a little bit like they would have had considerably less money at their disposal without these kinds of trades.
Absolutely. Certainly for Edward III, the wool, being able to manipulate the wool trade was a way of saving the crown from bankruptcy because of his wars with Scotland and France. He was very close. He was sailing pretty close to the wind, and initially they weren't sure how to take advantage of the wool trade, because Karen was talking about the monasteries, and a lot of this trade initially was with the church, trading with very influential Italian and Flemish merchants. And Durham, the Bishopric of Durham, had estates and manors with flocks, 4,000 sheep, and Fountains Abbey had 19,000 sheep. So there's a huge amount of investment, a huge amount of effort and supply being sold to these merchants who were looking for the best quality, and they were willing to pay high. It was the value to Europe was such that they were offering high prices, but they were actually offering credit as well, so, and years in advance. So you could be paid for the wool supply for 3 years' time, which, as far as the monasteries were concerned, was fantastic. Thank you very much. Ready cash, spend it now. So it paid for a lot of the monastic extensions and expansions and building programs. But as farmers today know that sheep spend most of their life looking for a reason to die, and were susceptible to sheep scab, and the losses were high. So you can promise a large wool clip in 3 years' time, but not be able to deliver it. So a lot of these monasteries found themselves in trouble financially, and places like Fountain were almost bankrupt on occasions.
Yeah, and individual farmers and individual sort of holdings of sheep, they weren't as big as modern farms are now, because you've got, as a farmer, as a shepherd, you've only got a relatively small number of sheep that you look after compared with modern farming and modern flocks and the size of flocks nowadays, because they're shepherding them with sort of portable gates called hurdles, and they're moving them round on the land, so they don't have massive huge fields that are all sort of gathered in with fences or hedges necessarily. You've got much more sort of open field systems, and so they're much more sort of they're using a lot more people, aren't they, to manage the sheep. So and they didn't necessarily have sheepdogs, so you're sort of shepherding your sheep round, and you're staying out with them, all summer. And then very often they have the village or the local area. They'll sometimes have, or the church will sometimes have its own flock, so the local small church may have its own flock. And then to manage that flock, they're sort of, in the Tudor period, there are records of each individual farmer in that area having to have one or two of the church sheep to manage. And then each year the church will do like a head count of those sheep, and you've got to account for the church's sheep that you've been looking after and return that wool clip to it. So it's quite a complex system, isn't it, sheep management?
Yeah.
But in terms of sort of the shearing and the sort of processing of the wool, that is again another complex sort of process, isn't it? It's not just a question of sort of you shear the sheep and then the wool suddenly is ready to weave. You've got all these different stages of processing that wool. And again, it's done by local people. It's done by, sometimes they're gathered together in what's known as a wool shed, and they're working together. But often these are people working in their cottages as individuals, and they're each sort of producing just a few what are called skeins of wool, isn't it? So they're each sort of spinning perhaps a few lengths of wool yarn, and someone will come and gather that from them on a weekly basis and supply them with more of this freshly clipped fleece. So you've got both sort of small scale local industries, haven't you, around areas like Alnwick, particularly in the north of England. You've got, because the fleece, the wool that's being produced by sheep within the north of England and into Scotland is a poorer quality than the wool that's being produced in places like the Cotswolds, places like Kent, places like Sussex, where you've got the downs, the downland, the chalk downlands, which are basically dedicated to raising sheep, and it's ideal for grassland. The further north you go, the shorter the span of the summer and the spring, and the fleece itself doesn't get as long to grow, does it?
No, and the fleeces on the northern breeds tend to be lighter in weight, so you don't get so much wool for your sheep, and it tends to be sort of a medium length staple.
By staple, Charlie, means the length of the hair. So early sheep shed their fleece naturally. It gets caught up on branches and things like that, and it sheds. And then in the sort of, we're talking Neolithic period, Neolithic and Bronze Age period, particularly Bronze Age, people begin to breed sheep that the fleece doesn't fall off naturally, and it needs to be cut and shorn. But it also only grows to a particular length. So annually, as soon as the winter comes, the sheep naturally, because of the shorter days, shorter nights, and less food, they stop growing their fleece, and you get this sort of natural break in the fibre, and that's called the staple. So the length that the fleece will grow between one shearing and the next is known as the staple. And I'm waving my hands around so you can't see what I'm doing, but basically the longest fleece that grows is about sort of 15, 16 centimetres maximum, isn't it? And that's quite a modern breed, and very fine. But you also get sheep where the length of the hair is no more than sort of about 4 or 5 centimetres, isn't it? And so they're more sort of like curly, short-haired fleece, quite dense, isn't it, and quite coarse. So by blending these different fibres, you can set a quality for your cloth. And if you've only got access to really short, stapled, quite poor quality fleece from little tiny sheep, they're nowhere near as big in the medieval period as they are now. You don't get as many garments from your flock, and that fleece isn't necessarily good enough to export. So you've got as well as the main export industry, which is bringing in all the revenue, around the Northumberland area, around the sort of Scottish border area into Cumbria, haven't you? You've got particular breeds of sheep, and the fleece is slightly coarser, slightly shorter. It's not so economically viable, and so that's being spun up locally and woven locally by local small weaving people, isn't it? Weavers.
But they had to blend it with sheep wool from places around Yorkshire and from Lincolnshire, and so this wool was transported by sort of middlemen, really, known as wool broggers, and they were transporting this up into Northumberland for making medium quality textiles, which were still very popular abroad and still fetched a reasonably good price.
It's not industrial, but it involves a whole set of people. It's not the abbots and the kings who are actually doing this work, though they might own the flocks.
That's it. Yeah, they're the big bosses. They're the big bosses who are paying the wages and paying for the weaving looms and things like that. But it's all done locally, isn't it? By local people.
There was an opportunity, certainly after the Black Death, in the mid 1300s, for peasant farmers who owned some land and had sheep were able to sell their own wool, but they would then collect the wool from within the district for other people. And if they were good enough entrepreneurs, they would be able to carve a business for themselves, selling and dealing in wool, and generate enough income to set up and start selling cloth. So they were buying the wool in or collecting the wool. They were taking the wool to people they knew were really good spinners, really good dyers, really good weavers, and they would take it from one group of artisans to the next group of artisans, then pick it up and take it to the next group of artisans and continue until they finally got a cloth that they could then sell for big money and start the whole ball again. But it meant that whole communities became dependent on these, what were to become known as clothiers or drapers, to sell and maintain this regular source of income for them, extra source of income for them. So in addition to their daily work on the farms, they had the money from their spinning and from their weaving to help see them through. So after the 1350s, you start to get this change in society, and a new class emerges, the sort of middle class, trading middle class emerges, and the wool broggers and the wool merchants are a big part in that.
The more we talk about it, the more it feels like English history would have been very different without all the sheep.
Oh, yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. We've been like a small Greek island, really, if we hadn't had the wool, because it determined trade. It wasn't just sort of later in the 15th century. You've got whole guilds of merchants. So Charlie's just talked about the rise of the sort of middle classes and the clothiers, and they are the beginning of the merchant classes, which are the people who later on into the sort of later medieval period, the 15th century and the 16th century, they are the people, the clothiers, the merchants, who are dealing in wool and dealing in cloth. They're the people who are basically building churches. You know, they've got so much money, these wealthy people, they are building entire churches. They are expanding sort of small Saxon or Norman churches, or, you know, small sort of Gothic churches, and they're creating these huge, what they call the wall churches throughout Suffolk and Norfolk.
And Cotswolds.
And the Cotswolds, where they're building these huge, massive edifices with massive stained glass windows, and they've got brasses in the floor dedicated to them over their tombs. They're building chapels within those, that they're dedicating in their own names, and they're providing charity as well, and they're providing housing. So they're creating almshouses for retired people that even today you can still see in a lot of English towns and villages. You can see almshouses, and the majority of those almshouses are being built and dedicated and funded for in perpetuity by these rich wool merchants, these rich wool clothiers, all across the country. Almost every county within England has got a church that if you dig deep enough, there will be some sort of form of a brass or a window. And if you look into the guidebook, you will find a wealthy merchant who started off as a wool clothier, and he's dedicated his money after his death. In his will, he has left an enormous fortune to the local people, and part of that is providing them with a church, but also it's providing housing. And it's only the villages sort of like Lavenham in Suffolk that, because their fortunes fell off after the Tudor period, after the Elizabethan period, and their houses weren't changed and made into Georgian properties, that's why when you visit those places you see photographs of them. They are these wonderful timber-framed houses, and they are all there because of the wool trade, because there were so many people in that place whose industry was funded
absolutely.
by the wool industry. It's incredible, the landscape that changed. All the towns and villages in Britain, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And farming changed completely. Vast areas of land that had previously been open field systems and ploughed, ridge and furrow, certainly over the Midlands and up into Northumberland and through Yorkshire. There's vast areas of field, acres and acres of field of ridge and furrow, which as soon as that medieval farming technique stopped, the land was enclosed and became pasture. And where the ridge and furrow is still very clear, they were grazing sheep on it, because any heavier animal would have damaged those what's now a fossilised landscape. So there was a massive expansion and growth in sheep farming through medieval England and into the Tudor period.
You mentioned Northumberland a few times,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a little look in our archive in preparation for talking with you, just to see what is said about sheep and wool here at the castle. Probably the most interesting document tells us more about the value of sheep. This is a document that appears in our book Lions of the North. It's a report from Robert Helm that accounts for livestock and household goods taken from the Earl of Northumberland's tenants during the year 1577. It's more Elizabethan than medieval, but it includes more than 2,000 sheep that were taken.
Ooh.
Wow.
So stolen sheep, and not just stealing a few sheep, 2,000 sheep.
That's a lot of sheep.
Yeah, but you begin to understand why they were so valued. They were worth stealing.
What Helm actually says is, he calls it a brief note of all such goods and chattels as hath been stolen and wrest from the tenants of the Earl of Northumberland within the county of Northumberland by the Scots, and thieves, since his entry until October last past, collected out of the hills of the said tenants, exhibited unto his lordship for their relief and redress therein. So he then lists all of the things. Lots of other things were stolen as well, but 2,000 sheep is the first thing mentioned in the document.
Wow. That is big, isn't it? That's a lot of sheep.
That's a lot of sheep to go missing.
Yes.
Difficult to replace as well, because sheep only they weren't breeding. They weren't often having twins, were they? As much as they do nowadays. No. This is hundreds and hundreds of years later. Farmers expect sheep to have twin lambs usually now, but they weren't necessarily having twins then, were they? So it's a one-for-one replacement and only one a year. A long time to replace those.
So you can see the document itself in Lions of the North. It should probably be pointed out that Earl of Northumberland, as important as the sheep would have been to him, probably had bigger problems at this point. 5 years earlier, which is where we found our earliest receipt for sales of sheep and wool, 1572, 1574, the 7th Earl had been beheaded by Elizabeth I, and so his successor at the time of that report is busy trying to keep himself out of the Tower of London and out of suspicion in case he gets his head cut off. So I think he would have felt the loss of 2,000 sheep, but he might have been thinking about his own head before any fleece.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And most of what else we have in the archive is much, much later. It's 18th century, where the management of sheep and wool, which is quite often spelled O-U-L-E, which we think might be a dialect thing. That there's accounts for the sale of wool going on through the second half of the 18th century. That's probably more due to better account management, easier transcription, and the fact that these records have been looked at maybe in a little bit more detail than some of the medieval ones. There could be more things to be found in the archives, but we can see that sheep are important enough that they had more than 2,000 of them to then get stolen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Scots, because Berwick was a very early staple port. And a staple port was a specific place where legally and by law you were only allowed to sell, export and import wool-based products to and from. And Berwick was quite early. It was established round about Edward I's reign, so it's early 14th century. Berwick, unfortunately, kept being overrun and overwhelmed by the Scots. So when Edward III declared that Newcastle upon Tyne was a staple port, became a major staple port, when the Scots were pushed back again and Berwick returned to England, to keep the thriving commercial community in Berwick, to keep them sweet, he guaranteed that they would keep the low tax tariffs in Berwick. Whereas Newcastle, he hit them with the full force of what was currently available, and that added an extra 30% onto the price of every single wool sack that was exported out of Newcastle, which was a massive amount of money. And basically, if they were able to circumvent Newcastle and deliver and sell their fleece through Berwick, that offered an 80% saving on their costs. So wool smuggling became a thing. And there's many accounts of it. There's the wrecking of a ship called the Trinity in 1341. And when that wreck was inspected, they found a load of untaxed wool sacks hidden underneath a load of coal. And the same happened in 1357, wool sacks hidden under coal. And in 1395, when the Christopher was seized, they found 30 wool sacks hidden under yet more coal and a load of grindstones. So wool really was quite literally entering the black market, and wool smuggling became a really serious issue for England all the way down the east coast, down even into Kent and Sussex.
So this is probably one of the things that the Percys here at the castle, if they're trying to keep law and order and control in the region, it's probably one of the concerns that they or their constables are having to think about.
All the time, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And they turn the people who are smuggling the wool, they turn poacher come gamekeeper, don't they? Because
absolutely.
They actually appointed one of the wool smugglers who was convicted for smuggling wool. He was then appointed as the customs officer in Newcastle, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So he just had to think, well, if you can't beat them, join them, sort of thing. And they obviously knew that he was obviously known to everybody, so they made him the customs officer. So he obviously knew who the people were that were working alongside him, smuggling wool, and he knew who to tap into. As soon as he saw a ship about to leave port, he would be there like a shot, wouldn't he?
Absolutely. It was a classic case of set a thief to catch a thief.
Yeah.
And in the early days, they were fined quite heavily if they were caught. But then the following year, because they knew the smuggling industry and they knew the best places to hide it, they'd know where the best places were to find it. So they were employed as customs officers. There were, certainly in Newcastle, towards the end of the 14th century, there were conflicts between the smuggling community and the customs community, because they were all trying to smuggle past each other and were blaming each other for the crimes. At this time, fining was the penalty for the crime. It was only as you're moving into the 17th and 18th centuries that you start to find the death penalty being imposed on sheep rustling and for wool smuggling.
Talking about the wool itself, you've alluded to it a little bit, of there is a process to get it from the sheep to what is then being exported from places like Berwick and Newcastle. This might be tricky on an audio podcast, but is it possible for you to talk us through the process of how that is created, how it goes from sheep to exportable wool? What have you got to do to it? Because I remember when you were here this summer with your spinning wheel and the other equipment, the loom and the weaving and the processes, it was a huge number of steps to get it to the finished product, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, first of all, you've got to catch your sheep and wash it. So certainly the monasteries were washing their sheep in the local rivers and streams, and these sheep washes have given rise to the names of villages and towns in the area. There's, in Dorset, you've got Sherborne, which has its own abbey, and you've got the Shear for shearing of the sheep, and the Bourne, which was the local dialect name for the river. And you find that all the way through, even into Northumberland. Places are named after these sheep wash sites on the streams. The sheep are then sheared, and the wool is removed from the sheep with little hand shears, which are like scissors, but with a spring at the back. The shorn wool is then picked, so they are picking all the debris and the brambles and the thorns and the thistles out from the fleece, and then it's sorted into various grades depending on the quality and the fineness. The wool is then scoured in hot water.
So it's washing.
So it's washing. By using hot water, they dissolve and remove the lanolin, which is the natural oily wax produced by the sheepskin to keep it waterproof and weatherproof. So that is removed. The washed and the clean wool is then beaten with willow sticks on hurdles, not laid flat like a tabletop. It's then beaten, and that action separates the wool fibres out, so it opens them up, and all the small particles and small amounts of debris are then allowed to fall freely from the fleece to the ground. It's effectively removed. At this stage, it's possible to dye that loose wool fleece. So you're starting to introduce different colours into the material as you're processing it. The wool is then oiled. So you've removed the lanolin through the scouring process. Oil is then deliberately reintroduced by mixing either butter or olive oil, which was a big import for the wool trade from abroad. You're reintroducing this oil into the material, so it's then can then be combed. So long wool with a long staple is combed with these big, long, gnarly teethed combs, so that all the fibres are parallel and the short fibres are removed, and that produces what's known as the warp, or the yarn that runs vertically through a cloth.
So when it's spun, that gets combed through these long pointy teeth, doesn't it? And you have the comb is held in place, usually either attached to a post or held fixed in a bench, isn't it? And then you have the other comb in your hands, and you put the two combs together and you separate out the fleece into long twists. Well, they're long sort of fibres, aren't they? So like one long continuous roving that allows you then to spin that up and twist that into a fibre, into a yarn. So the other way of processing the fleece, ready to spin it, is using the carders that people are more familiar with nowadays. So combs aren't used by modern spinners very often now. You don't see pairs of combs very often because they are a bit scary looking, aren't they? They usually have about teeth that are about 8 or 9 inches long, and they're very sharp. But most people nowadays that are doing sort of processing fleece for spinning, they're using carders, which are little tiny bent wires, aren't they, in a what would have been a leather cloth, and they're put onto boards now, aren't they? So they're like two bats, like two paddles, almost like sort of table tennis bats, aren't they? But they're square, and that then creates a more sort of twisted up fibre, isn't it?
Yeah, it's more. Rather than combing the fibres parallel to each other, it creates a very loose, airy,
fluffy
matrix.
Yeah, fluffy mass, isn't it? And the little hairs are going in all directions. So that's used when that's spun in a different way, isn't it? So the long, straight, combed fibre is usually spun with what's called a drop spindle or just a spindle, and that's a stick then with a weight on it. And you see medieval illustrations with these, usually women pictured, with what's called a distaff, where they've got a long stick and they dress all of these long rovings. They wind those rovings around this stick at the top, and they will tuck it in their belt, won't they, or have it under their arm, and then they can hold this little drop spindle, this little lead whirl, which is like it's like a polo mint, isn't it? It's like a little mint with a hole in it. Lead polo mint. And that helps to weight down the stick. And then by spinning that stick and spinning that whirl together, you put a twist in the fibre, and that twist is what then turns that from individual hairs into a long thread and a yarn. And so the fact that you've combed this into long rovings means that all the hairs are parallel to each other, and they form a much stronger thread then, don't they? When you spin that up, you get a very fine, very strong thread, even though it's just a single thread, and that's taken onto your weaving loom, and that is called the warp. And the warp is the long threads that run continuously through your whole bolt of cloth. So it starts at one edge and it's rolled onto a roller, isn't it? And then that whole length of cloth, so however long that cloth is, however many metres of cloth you've got or yards of cloth, that thread that you're spinning at that point, that becomes the whole length of that cloth. And so it has to be really strong, because what you don't want is a breakage. And then the short fluffy fibres that are then spun later on a spinning wheel, aren't they, on called a great wheel, which is still the same. It's still a twist that's put into it, but it's then you spin it with a great big wheel, like a big cart wheel, that then a string goes round and it twists the metal spindle, doesn't it, that comes off the end. That then is used as a weft thread, which doesn't have to be as strong, because that's going across the cloth, and you can have lots and lots and lots of short little, almost like they're little bobbins, aren't they, of thread.
Quills. Yeah,
so you then spin that onto a quill, and that quill now in modern times, they still use a method, but sometimes they use a drinking straw, don't they, to hold it. But in the medieval period, that would have been a goose quill. So a goose quill feather, a little tube, you're spinning onto that little tube on your spinning wheel, and then you can just take that off and slot that into your shuttle, which is what you're using to pass that weft across your weaving loom very quickly, aren't they? They're spinning that very quickly. So you've got two different sorts of yarn that you're making, a warp and a weft thread. And of course, if you're then making that in different fibres sometimes, aren't you? Different coloured fibres, and you're then weaving that in either one across, one up, aren't you? Over and under.
Over and under, one over, one under.
One over, one under.
Which is known as tabby. or plain weave
or tabby. And then if you want a more complex cloth, and that cloth then, when it's finished, that would then need to be another form of process called fulling. But if you want a more complex cloth, a more decorative cloth, even without putting different colours into it, you can have a more complex weaving pattern, and that's known as a twill. And that can be numbers of threads that go up and down and go up and across, and you end up with something that looks a bit like a crosshatch, don't you, in the cloth?
You have a diagonal pattern running through the cloth.
Yeah. Little diamond shapes, aren't they, very often? Diamond twill, it's known as.
So after weaving, you can dye the cloth, the plain cloth, and that's known as being dyed in the piece. But it then needs washing, so all the oil that you put in when you started spinning now needs to be removed, so that the cloth is washed. And then it's burled, or a process known as burling, where all the knots and the faults in the cloth are identified and removed.
And sewn back in, aren't they? Broken threads.
Yeah.
Broken threads are sewn back in.
So you tidy up the cloth by burling, and then it's taken to the fuller. And the fuller, certainly in the early medieval period, would have worked with his feet in a large tub, and he would be treading or walking the cloth. And quite often the cloth was sprinkled with fuller's earth, which would help the cloth to shrink to its correct dimensions and would start felting together.
And it firms it up,
and
it?
It firms it up.
Tightens
up the cloth. And certainly from the 14th century onwards, fulling mills start to appear in the countryside. So this process of finishing cloth is becoming industrialised even in the 1300s. And this happens in the countryside because to run a fulling mill, you need a body of moving water, so local streams and rivers, which put the urban cloth makers at a bit of a disadvantage.
And that's made with hammers, isn't it?
Yes.
So instead of pressing it and treading it with feet, you then end up with these big, heavy wooden hammers that are attached to a roller, aren't they?
Yes, like water wheels.
And a water wheel. So the water going down through the mill makes these hammers rise and fall in sequence. And so you've got this very noisy, very loud process of these hammers hammering the cloth repeatedly to do that process much quicker than a person in a trough with their feet, and they can process much larger quantities of cloth, can't they?
Yeah.
And then after having shrunk it, which fulls it and makes it thicker and felted, you've then got to try and make it straight again, because you've ended up with this sort of shrunken, thick, matted cloth, and you want to get it as big as possible because it's sold by the yard and by the width, isn't it? So then they stretch it out again.
The dimensions of cloth were regulated by the guilds and through the legal system. So the size and the correct size and length of a cloth was defined and very clear. So that these cloths had to be stretched again to the right size using open fields with what were known as tenter frames, which were long frames with stood upright with hooked nails, tenter hooks.
That's it, and that's a phrase that we still use nowadays. If you're feeling tense and you're feeling really taut and tight, then you're said to be on tender hooks or tenterhooks. If you're under tension, if you're stressed and under tension, you're on tenter hooks on the edge of your seat, sort of thing. And that's exactly where that phrase comes from, is by tentering and stretching these cloths out. And you see paintings, don't you, sort of paintings from the later sort of 18th, 19th century, and in the distance of these beautiful landscapes, we saw one in Gloucestershire, didn't we, in a museum. You've got these cloths almost like sails in the landscape going across the fields, by yards and yards and yards and yards and yards, just continuous stretch, and they almost look like cricket screens on a cricket pitch. They're just huge. Repeat over and over and over, aren't they, in these fields? Layers and layers and layers, all different colours, and they're being stretched taut to dry so that then they're flat and they're the right shape and size,
Yes.
aren't they? And then you can fold your cloth up.
But the problem for clothiers at the time was that this was the first moment when your finished product, your cloth, your expensive cloth, was exposed to the possibility of theft. And there are countless legal accounts of people being caught having stolen cloth from tenterfields. So once the cloth has been stretched, it's then rowed, and rowing involves the use of another bat, but this time not with short wires on it, but it has teasels attached to it. And these teasels are run in both directions across the cloth to raise the nap or to make it fluffy. And this action was repeated about 3 or 4 times. And in between each rowing, you would shear the cloth. And this was done with a very, very large pair of heavy sprung scissors, a good 2 foot in size. And this was worked by the shearer. This was worked very carefully across the surface of the cloth on a curved cushioned bench. And this again followed the rowing. So this was going backwards and forwards 4, 5, 6 times between these two artisan groups.
And that was to make it finer, wasn't it?
To make it finer.
Make it a very, very fine, thin cloth.
So the fluffiness was really shortly cropped and hid the type of weave. You couldn't see the weave pattern in the cloth. For producing cloth for outdoor wear, so sort of heavy overcoats and waistcoats and things, and cloaks, it would go through a process of frizzing. You would dampen the cloth after it had left the shearing. It would dampen the cloth, and then you'd work over it with an iron blade in sort of circular motion to raise the nap further and produce this heavy felted surface.
And then finally it's weighed and measured, and they have this little seal, this lead seal that gets put on the edge where it's after it's inspected, and it shows that it's a good enough quality. And each clothier would have their own name or initials or their mark on this lead seal, and that was their standard. And so then you've got accounts of sort of people like Thomas Tusser's wife, people who have written books, written their accounts and their life histories through history. You've got the wives urging the husbands to go and shop with a particular clothier and to try and search for this quality cloth that they had last time. Don't get this poorer quality cloth. Make sure you get it from this particular clothier. And they're identified by their little lead seals. And sometimes that's also how the cloth is identified, that they've paid the right export tax on it or import tax on it, is it has another lead seal attached. And those little lead seals are what are found by metal detectorists very often, aren't they, in fields. They find these little tiny discs with initials in them, and often a little tab, because they're double-sided and they're folded over the edge of the cloth. And so you find these in fields, you find these in rivers and stuff, don't you? Yeah. The London mudlarks find them. And they're like a tiny remnant of this entire industry, because every single one of those would have been attached to an enormous length of cloth, wouldn't they? So they're found really, really commonly, aren't they? They're very common to find these little lead seals. But that's the way that people know that they're getting the right quality cloth and who the cloths come from, isn't it? And they've got standards to upkeep,
So I think it's probably fair to say that after all of that, it's a really exhaustive process from sheep to what you're selling. But for hundreds of years, it must have been worth all that effort for the benefits and the profits that it brought in. And I guess the last thing really to ask is what happened, because wool is not our number one export anymore. It's not as vital to the economy as it would have been 500, 600, 700 years ago. So what changed? Was it the Industrial Revolution?
It started with that as people began to move towards urban towns and later cities. People in the countryside became aware that these growing populations needed feeding, and the medieval and the Tudor style of farming wasn't really capable of producing meat products on that sort of scale. So things had to change. And it started with the sheep. It started with breeding sheep. Before the Industrial Revolution, sheep were valued for their fleece. They were valued for their milk and for their cheese, because these are regular annual resources, and you still had a sheep at the end of it. But mutton became important, and the volumes of sheep and cattle moving down to places like Smithfield Market increased over time. So they needed to change the shape of the sheep. So it became much heavier, much squarer, much bulkier, and genetically they were mixing and matching purely to change the shape of the carcass rather than the quality of the sheep, of the fleece.
That was part of it, but in terms of sort of the cloth and why woolen cloth and woven cloth began to change over from wool to later cotton, really, which was again a cloth that became very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. That became worn more by people rather than wool, to do with the fact that the economics of it and the volume that could be produced. You've got cotton being imported from America in the 18th century. And in terms of the economics of that, everybody knows that the only reason that cotton was produced so cheaply was because they weren't paying their labour force. Mm-hmm. And so you've got industrial mechanised mills that then begin to be created to match the new fibre that's being imported to this country from America. And that's replacing not just linens, because the other cloth that's being worn in large quantities is linen grown from flax, and that's being worn next to your skin, and some hemp. But again, it's much harder to grow. Linen is much harder. It's much more thirsty as a crop. And again, it's being grown locally in this country, and you've got all the economics of that. But the difference is that when people began to produce cotton in mechanised big mills, the other thing they were able to do with this fibre was they were printing onto that cotton, and they were producing decorative outerwear for the first time that was a lighter weight fabric. And so all of a sudden you've got suddenly this concept of sort of seasonal fashions that up until that period in the 18th century, you really didn't have. People wore wool all year round. You just wore a slightly lighter weight wool in the summer. Ask us when we're at Alnwick in August, we're still wearing wool. We're not wearing linen as an outer garment because linen wasn't worn as an outer garment. But with the rise in production of beautiful patterned cottons, which were much, much cheaper to buy than woolen cloth, then all of a sudden the fashion changed, and people began to accept that you could wear these lightweight patterned dresses, patterned jackets, and men's clothing and women's clothing for the poorer people, certainly for the large majority of the population. All of a sudden you find garments being produced as outerwear that don't involve wearing wool. And all the way through, really, the sort of from the later spring through the summer and into the autumn. So people aren't needing to buy as much wool as they were. And the woolen industry can't compete, really, in terms of these cheap, bulk, mass-produced cloths, because weaving wool is, although they are using larger scale industrial mills, it's not as easy. They go through many more processes, don't they, to process the wool than you do with cotton fibre. Cotton fibre, it's much stronger. It doesn't need all these finishing processes in the same way as wool does. And so all of a sudden, for the poorer people, for the lower classes, all of a sudden it makes more economic sense for them if they can be wearing several layers of cotton rather than a higher quality. And so you get this division between what you have now, really, is that even now, proper wool suiting, everybody had one good wool suit, but that wool suit, once you bought it, you didn't have another one, did you? You didn't need to buy another one. You had your good wool suit, and that would last years and years and years, whereas cotton, being a finer fibre, it would wear out and you would replace it, and you would have, because it was cheaper, you could sort of ring the changes and have different coloured garments and have many more garments. So it was to do with that really as well. I was like, wool, you've got one good wool coat in your wardrobe, you don't need another one. Whereas in terms of economics, you could have several different coloured dresses or jackets in cotton because they were much cheaper. So it was a gradual shift, wasn't it? So there's a gradual shift across, to do with economics, to do with fashion, and really to do with the fact that the cotton industry wasn't having to pay their labour force in the same way that the woolen industry always had and always would. So that's one of the reasons.
And to keep up with the times, the whole process of creating cloth, woolen cloth, became very, very heavily industrialised and mechanised. And we're all familiar with the idea of child labour and these small children just crawling around underneath these vast pieces of machinery, putting their lives at risk for the sake of the cloth. The wool ties into the rise in the philanthropic movement with mill owners and people like Titus Salt, who looked at the more humane ways of looking after his workers and building new places, new settlements, new villages like Saltaire and the mills there, purely so that he was moving the people out from the slums in Bradford. So there's many knock-on effects on the industrialisation of the woolen industry. At the beginning of it, there was always this backlash from the people who had spent their earnings in their cottages, working from home all the time. These new types of machine were reducing the need for that sort of working environment, and these people were becoming unemployed as their jobs were taken over by the new fangled machinery. And as a backlash to that, there were riots in the early 19th century. And they were deliberately smashing up and trying to vandalise these machinery to the point where they were unusable. And you get the Luddite movement, Luddite rebellions coming from that.
It's really a fascinating story that spans centuries. And it's been a really interesting dive into all of that history of what we wear and what we used to wear. I hope that when people listen to this, they go and dig out a woolly jumper or some woolly socks made of wool that they've got and put those on while they're listening. Thank you both very much for explaining such an everyday material that actually has been so important to our history. So thank you very much, Karen and Charlie.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We hope you had fun hearing about the surprising history of wool on today's episode. For more from Company of Artisans, head into our podcast back catalogue and look for episode 70, The Case of the Percy Tiles, or episode 47, Illuminated Manuscripts and the Medieval Scriptorium. If you haven't given the Alnwick Castle podcast a rating or review yet, please do, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, especially as you can now listen to the podcast on YouTube. Search for the Alnwick Castle channel on YouTube and click the podcast tab where you'll find every episode we've done to date. We'll be back in 2026 after taking our usual December break with another set of episodes of the Alnwick Castle podcast. Until then, I've been Daniel. Thank you very much for listening and goodbye.